One thing is for certain. Just because it's tried and true doesn't mean it's working right now. So the big question is this: where can you learn what is working right now? The strategies, the tactics, the psychology, and the exact how-to. How to grow your business. How to blow up your personal brand and supercharge your personal growth. That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answer. My name is Sharran, and welcome to Business School. So who actually calls you Dr. Tim Vogus? Does anyone call you Dr. Tim Vogus?
No one calls me doctor. Well, I guess maybe in an intro email, if somebody wants to ask me for something, Dr. Vogus, will you do this for me? But otherwise, no. I mean, so most students are like just Vogus.
Yeah.
But there's also, hey, Vogus, do this for me. I as you well know, I'm fine with just first names, right? I'm not a big titles kind of person.
Yeah.
And even on occasion, as you well know, people go to the old hip hop nickname for me.
Yeah. So let's break that down first, because I think that's good rapport building here. So how did T-Love come about?
So T-Love came about in high school. We were just coming up with nicknames in high school, and to be honest, T-Love for me in high school, given my track record with love in high school, was mostly ironic, I think. But it was kind of like, I came up in the era where, those were the kind of rap names: Ice-T, Ice Cube, T-Love, D-Nice, Greg Smooth, Greg Nice, like those kind of things,
You spit out like 9 of those really fast there.
But it's the era, right? Like those are the things, so that was in the early 90s,
Yeah.
So when I got that, so it was probably junior or senior year in high school. That was my nickname. And it stuck.
And it stuck. Not only did it stick, but your passion has stuck for it.
Oh yeah.
Since then too, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've loved rap music. The first time I heard it, my brother, who's younger than me, and I don't know why he got this. He got an audio cassette for a birthday or Christmas or something called Electric Breakdance. And this had on it, so it was like 1984 probably. And on it had Jam on It by Nucleus. It's a classic. It had White Lines by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. It had It's Like That by Run DMC. So off their first album. This is 2 albums before Walk This Way, and they changed the whole game. So that song just opened it up when I heard it, because it had a real social consciousness to it. It was talking about poverty and a lot of different things, but it was just the rock combined with the hip hop, and it was just in your face. And that was it. I was hooked. I've loved rap music since I was 9 years old.
So how do you stay kind of connected to the genre while having kids at home, watching language?
Yeah.
How do you do all that?
Yeah, well, and my kids don't really like it. And some of that they most assuredly should not be listening to. But it's, so how I stay current on it is just, Twitter. I follow a lot of people, try to stay up on, some of those things like Rap Caviar and stuff like that, sites that kind of push it out. So I'm not, and my students, once they know I like rap music, they'll say, "Oh, have you heard?" And the answer is typically no. But the other thing that helps me stay current is I listen to Hip Hop Nation on Sirius XM. So that has a little bit of the more current stuff. I mean, within a relatively narrow band, because it's like any kind of commercial radio, plays same songs over and over again. So those are the ways I stay up on it. But I also still, track with some of my old favorite artists. People have been releasing albums for a long time, like Run the Jewels just released a new album this summer. That's great. But it's their 4th one, right? Like, so I've been with them a while. So you just kind of stay on board with some of your old favorites. Like Black Thought's got a new thing coming out from The Roots. So stay with
I hope people are enjoying it, because I have zero idea what you're talking about.
Right. And clearly, there is no limit to my desire to talk to about this in great detail. I,
So,
I am a nerd on many things, on many levels, Sharran. This is one of the ways in which I am a nerd.
so this
I
is
love to just talk about
so
this.
I'm assuming this. So this is a definitely a kind of a good counterbalance to the kind of deep work that you do both because as you are a as you not only are you in a teaching institution, but you are in a practical teaching institution teaching business school students and the exec MBA students, but
Yep.
you're also in a under the umbrella of a research institution.
Yep.
So you're where just for guidance for audience perspective, where are your current kind of research interests? Where do they lie? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm working on like three categories of things. So one of them, so a longstanding interest of mine has been in healthcare quality and safety, something that is totally irrelevant at the current moment, right? Like we don't need to worry about that at all. So the things I look at in that domain are around organizational culture, specifically does a culture of safety that prioritizes safety relative to other interests, get created and sustained. And some of the things I look at are really team dynamics around mindfulness. So team level mindfulness. So not so much the individual kind of meditative, kind of contemplative practice, but how can we interact with each other more mindfully such that we can detect and correct errors and unexpected events more swiftly.
Yeah.
So obviously that's something that's important in the moment. And the other thing about healthcare delivery and kind of delivering high quality, safe care that's of great interest to me is how do we keep, sustain the workforce, right?
Yeah.
Like how do we make sure the people who are delivering the care are in a safe workplace for themselves, and not just physically safe, although clearly right now that's critically important, but also emotionally and mentally and psychologically safe. So the thing I study there over the past few years is with Laura McClelland at Virginia Commonwealth University is about compassion practices. So how can organizations systematize compassion such that it's not just saying to employees, care delivery folks who are, facing unprecedented levels of burnout right now. It's not just you take a resilience training and figure it out for yourself, or engage in some, just meditate a little bit, or be more self-compassionate. But actually, what is the organization doing to kind of intervene in specific ways to help people process the traumas they're encountering using things like forums called Schwartz rounds, where people talk about not just the event itself, if there's a death or some other very traumatic event, but also how we're processing it emotionally and how we're going to get through this as people as well. So, intervening in those kind of ways. And then the last bit that's been newer in the past 3-4 years has been on autism at work, and specifically making organizations more inclusive for neurodiversity. And obviously, as you know, that's something that's very personally important to me, given my family. But it's also a big issue out in the world because up to 80% of the people on the autism spectrum are either underemployed or unemployed, which is just a tragic waste of a lot of talent, right? And people not able to do things that, they're just systematic barriers to getting and staying in the workforce. So the kind of things that I'm looking at are how can you make organizational cultures be less maybe about organizational fit and more about how do we get new contributions from different types of people, because neurodiversity is all about different ways of thinking. Yeah. So, and some of the things we're working on there is about kind of organizational research, but also technologies. So how can we use things like virtual interviewing systems to take down some of the pressures of in-person interviewing? Yeah. And how can we set up interviews in a way so it's actually accessing people's talents, not just causing them to stress out? So in our virtual interview system, people wear sensors so we can sense stress levels and know exactly which question sets off the stress level, and also might cause them to break eye contact and also make worse answers. So we have a natural language processing kind of engine on top of this. So it's some real cool tech that's kind of intersecting with my interest in organizations and making it more inclusive. Yeah. So those are the three sets of things that I'm working on.
Way cool. I don't know if you know this, take you back to business school for a second. When I was your student was, one of the projects, like when we started out, you had all of us kind of read and write like this little short synopsis every single day. You're like, hey, just A little bit, right? A little bit. And uh, it's super fascinating that for someone like me, where I am today, where I write 1.6 million emails a month,
Right.
versus at that point, I would stress out writing one paragraph on
Yep.
something that I had read.
Yep.
And you may not know this background. I actually like talked to my dad. My dad was a professor of English literature at college. And I talked to my dad. I was like, hey, I got, my professors want me to like write a synopsis. And I think it's just this accountability thing of me having to read something, but I'm writing this one paragraph and it totally sucks. It takes me 4 hours to write. And it's taking me longer to write a paragraph than to read like three case studies.
Right.
And so my dad said to me, which is when kind of I had this first conversation with you, he's like, well, talk to him. And I was like, well, what do you mean? This is just I have to deliver a deliverable. He's like, no, if it's stressing you out,
Yeah.
you should have the conversation with him. And for those that are listening, I want to fast forward on the learning there, right? So the learning that I learned kind of my first year at business school was I never believed in thinking in drafts. And you said something which was very cool to me once. You're like, hey, at the end of the day, when you're turning in a deliverable, a paper, whatever, it just ends up being your 16th draft. Like that's all it is. It's not your final paper. It's just your 16th draft.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, what is that? Like, really? And he's like, what are you trying to do? He's like, Sharran, what are you trying to do? You're trying to give me your perfect draft the first time? Like, that's weird. And while it logically made sense,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I don't think we as society have been given the permission to think in drafts.
Right.
And
Right.
I'd love for your kind of, because even in your research work, there's draft reviews and peer reviews and all of that stuff that happens.
Yes.
From a very practical perspective, if you're talking to like an entrepreneur or business owner, I don't think the average entrepreneur or business owner even gets somebody to review a sensitive email once from a draft perspective. So I'd love your thoughts around like this concept of maybe thinking in drafts a little bit to just sharpen your thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I also want to just praise you personally because I think your deliberate focus on that is rare among MBA students who don't think that, this, even with as much writing as we do, there's a practice and a method and a technique to it. You can be deliberate about it, right? Okay, I struggle with this part. So what can I do to get me on a better trajectory of writing about it, right? So I think this idea of thinking in drafts is great. And it's also made hard because I think sometimes so much of what should be a draft goes out into the world as a tweet or a LinkedIn post or something like that, right? And then there's a reaction, oh, well, I didn't really think it through. So everything feels more final, right? And it doesn't feel like we have the license to be provisional. So finding those, so I think just as I told you long ago, I think just viewing it as everything is just an ongoing process, right? Like even a published paper that's what I'm thinking now, right? Like that's what this set of data tell me. But if I think that's something that I have to permanently defend, even when things change, I'm not doing science, right? Like I'm not revising. I think you need to update your thinking, and updating your thinking is okay. And that where we get into trouble is where we think, well, we can't be inconsistent with what we thought in the past. Well, if the situation changes, the data changes, we've got to move in that direction. And the essence of the stuff that I do around mindfulness, when I'm talking about interpersonal mindfulness and mindfulness in communication, it's all about recognizing that whatever we have is a situated understanding of the moment. And that's something that we need to keep updating. So when we talk about mindfulness in teams, so healthcare teams that are really reliable, that make very few errors, or if they do make them, they recover super quickly. What do? Well, what they is they're reluctant to simplify interpretation. So they keep more ideas in play. That's this kind of provisional idea, right? Like I'm keeping a lot of drafts going. And they're also sensitive to operations, which means I'm trying to integrate the best understanding I have at this moment. It's not a permanent understanding. If I think it's a permanent understanding and hey, we're great right now, so we'll be great in perpetuity, that's when I know bad things are going to happen. So the people that lock in and say we're highly reliable, or wow, this is the perfect draft. This is the perfect email. This is the perfect document. That's when you're in trouble.
Yeah. Is there, how much of this do you think, Tim, is the lack of a support system? And what I mean by that is, you know, so especially during one of our last businesses, my partner of 20 years, just a phenomenal guy. He's like a father to me, even though he thinks that he's like my little brother, which is hilarious, right? And he's an attorney, but he's a very, he realized that there's a kindness that comes with good writing. And that was the one thing that he taught me. He was like, hey, you're writing like a boss. No one wants to listen to you. No one wants a bossy email. And to me, I was like, hey, this is my quote position in the organization, so I should write from a position specific status, whatever. And what he said to me was he would take my email and be like, hey, you can change 4 words on this and make it so much kinder. And I got better, just like I would send, even though Tim, I owed you as part of a class deliverable 1 email, you were so kind to say, hey, I'll give you feedback and go revise it. And if you will write the 4 drafts, I will give you the feedback to revise the 4 drafts.
Right.
And so my partner always, and I think I got lucky with, you know, having a mentor like you and having a business partner like my partner, Peter, who I can, without judgment, send him something, even a happy Thanksgiving email to the firm. I'm like, this is going out to 1,000 people from me. Can you just like look it over once to make sure it's not, and he's like, Sharran, you're a little emotionally charged in this one. Are you okay? And I'm like, I never saw that.
Right.
So my question for you is, I don't know if everyone has a support system to have somebody, you know, kind of do that. How does, and we're talking very specific with writing, it can be with video, it can be with whatever.
It can be with anything, sure.
Yeah, but I think that in today's writing especially, my writing got better just because I was able to get someone else to give me some feedback on it. And how does
But you also took the feedback too, right? Like you also treated it as, okay, when I hear it, I'm going to try to incorporate it, right? Like you could take that if you have the boss mindset, even with this outside person saying, all right, well, they just don't get it. I don't believe that really says that. Or if I give you feedback and I be like, yeah, what does it really matter? It's a pass fail little item anyway, right? Like I'm just gonna send it out, right? Like
so how does the lone gunslinger business owner today, how does that person think in drafts without putting themselves in a tough position?
Yeah, and I think you're right about reaching out, because everybody, even if you're the lone business owner, you probably have people, because all it takes, like you're describing, is somebody who's outside of your particular head, right? Like to give you that kind of feedback, to be that sounding board. And there are those kind of places, and there are resources like for small business people or whatever, like incubators and those kind of, that's why those things exist, is to provide a mechanism for feedback, for coaching, for growth, for collegiality, for relationships, and for all those kind of things. I mean, I think the biggest thing they did, you know, you said, you know, I was kind to you by, you know, reading and commenting on those 4 versions or whatever, but it took you asking. That's all it took, right? Like most people don't ask about something that is, so asking for some feedback on something that's tractable, like you can give me coaching on this, it won't take too much of your time. I will take seriously what you say, and I really value your opinion, right? Like, and I'm trying to work on this. So you conveyed all those things. And I think that's the essence of being able to get that kind of developmental support, because everybody has people in their life who can provide some measure of that, right? And it's just the saying, here's why I'm coming to you, right? Like, I value your opinion. I think you have a special skill at this, and I'm not going to take up too much of your time, and I'll do this, and I'm also happy to do it for you. Right? Like, and I think because even if it's hard for us to maybe judge our own writing all the time, we can still, it's hard for everybody to judge their own writing. So we can offer that back, and just being an outsider to it. Are you sure? Like I even did that today. So my wife, Jen, I was going to send an email that I probably shouldn't have sent. So I read it to her and she's like, I think you can just sit on that one. And you know, and she was right. And so I didn't send it. You know, but just having that person on the outside, sometimes it's not to do it, sometimes it's changing those few words and something where I'm getting too boss in tone.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's reflective of good practice in general, which is trying to engage in perspective taking, right? Trying to get that empathic understanding of others. How is this going to be received? Because we know our intention, we don't know how it's going to be received, right? So that having that outsider just give us that feedback on writing, a presentation, or whatever it is helpful, because it shows us how people take it, right? And that's fundamental to so many things in organizations. You know, the compassion stuff I do is all about that, right? Like it starts with an empathic understanding of, oh, somebody else is in suffering, let me learn more. And mindfulness, it's about, hey, at least my version of studying mindfulness, it's like, something's not quite right in this system. I'm worried something's going to go wrong and something's going to blow up, right? Yeah. Like, so it's, you know, trying to get outside of your head and to take the perspective of something else or someone else.
And Tim, I don't know, one thing that my business partner, one of the things that I learned from him was his writing is on point. Like he's one of those where you can write a 4-paragraph email, he will write a 1-line response, and it is filled with so much warmth, grace, and it's perfect. Like it's a perfect 1-liner every time, right? And normally if someone wrote a 1-liner, I'd be like, I can't believe Vogus gave me a 1-liner back, right?
What a jerk.
but when Peter writes a 1-liner, you're like, that was perfect. Yep. But even though what I learned from him was, we as a partnership, our three partners, we decided that no email will go out all hands unless the partners reviewed it. And so it became, so even Peter would send me his email saying, hey, I wrote this draft, what do you think? And I'm like, dude, you got to chill out. He's like, oh, I think I was angry on that one, but he was open to the drafts too. Yep. And I think that allowed me to be more open to the drafts as well.
And and when you start to do that as leadership of the organization, what does that do? It starts to set what's the culture of the organization. We're working in this together because we want to get things right. We want to convey what our intention is. We want it to be received in a particular way. So we're going to put in the effort to do that right. And we're going to listen to and critique each other. And it's okay. It's okay to be wrong, right? And to get feedback and to update and change. And that's how you convey the thinking in drafts, because everybody in that organization is looking to the three of you for cues about what's this organization about? What is it? Value, support, and reward. And by saying, you know, we're going to be really diligent about how we communicate. And we want to do that with kindness, with grace, but also with focus and intention and strategic, you know, a specific strategy, right? You want to do all those things. And it's hard to do all those things in written communication or in verbal communication.
Yeah. One of my favorite classes was doing negotiation stuff with you, because the big skill, and I'm using this when I was thinking about talking with you today. The draft thing was everything for me, because I think it even jumps into the negotiation world in a lot of ways as well, right?
Yes.
And when people say everything's a negotiation, the one thing that I learned was that it is actually a capability. I didn't think it was. I was like, oh, some people are just good salespeople. I'm like, well, no, I can mechanically learn to negotiate better. And the biggest win for me on that, Tim, was there was this exercise, I think early on, where like I lost, like based on who got what chip. I was like, whatever happens here, I'm going to lose in this negotiation. And I didn't realize, I was like, this sucks. Like, why am I, like, I lost. This is stupid. And then I realized that it was not about the losing. And there were some cards that you are dealt, and you deal, you think in drafts to figure out the best possible outcome. And there was no way for me to win in one of those. And so I thought that was super fascinating. And I didn't realize that negotiation was a capability. I thought you were just either good at it or not good at it. And there's some mechanical things in place that you can at least prep for. And I'd love to kind of, have you talk through a couple of those things. And the first thing is more, I always talk to people about, hey, like the BATNA and the ZOPA stuff, right? Without that, you literally have like, what are you doing? You don't even know what you're doing, right?
Right, because if you don't know that, what do you know, right? Like, how do you know how to make a decision?
So I'd love for you to maybe just, for folks that have not had the
Yep.
some mechanical understanding of, hey, there's a few pieces that are in place just
Yeah.
for thinking tool perspective. If
Yep.
you could just say, hey, what is BATNA? What is ZOPA? And how do you
Sure.
kind of enter a negotiating conversation
Yep.
with those in mind?
Absolutely. So I want to link it back to something you just said prior to that, with just thinking about being a good or bad negotiator. Some people are just good at it, some people are just bad at it. And I think it's because of the mental image we have of what a negotiator is. We think it's somebody who goes into a situation, bullies somebody into what they want, right? Like they just give in to my perspective. So that's a problem. That's a really narrow way to conceptualize it. And you can see why a lot of people would feel uncomfortable in negotiation situations, because they don't see themselves as that way. They're not that way. So they don't want to behave like that. And they want to avoid dealing with people who behave like that. And then also, with that kind of mindset, it becomes an act of persuasion. So it's not about drafts. It's not about thinking in drafts. I don't need to know what the other side thinks, values, cares about. I just need to go in there and bulldoze it. And both of those things get in the way, especially with things, the kind of complexity of negotiations you've done, but even in pretty basic negotiations, that breaks down. Yeah. So now let's get into the kind of the tools of the trade and some of the basics. Yeah. So the things going into a negotiation that you want to be thinking about is, obviously you want to know where you stand and why, right? So where you stand is, at what point do I walk away from this deal? Does it need to be better than X, whatever price, buying a car, thinking about that kind of thing. So there's a point at which you would rather walk away and just not make that deal happen. So going in, knowing that, being clear on what your bottom line is, we call that a reservation price, a point at which you walk away. And now what helps shape that doesn't just come out of like your imagination. You're thinking about what the market is, but it's really about what your alternatives are. And that's where this idea of BATNA is. So what's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? That's BATNA. And so BATNA is what you get when you walk away. And sometimes that answer is, I get nothing. Nothing, yeah. Right? So some of the most important things you can do in a negotiation sometimes are things before you get into the negotiation itself, like generating more alternatives and more possibilities. Because when you do that, you can make your reservation price, if higher or lower, depending on which side of the negotiation you're on. So you can bolster your own position. So you can be more confident in your walkaway and you can demand more. And then you want to think about that for yourself and you want to know that, but you also want to start thinking about it for the other side, the other party in the negotiation. What do I think their alternatives might be? If I was them, how would I be thinking about this negotiation? So you try to put yourself in their perspective. So this kind of other-oriented, perspective-taking kind of perspective. So what are their alternatives? And what do I think that means for when they walk away? So in between those two walk-away points is the realm of the possible in the negotiation, which we call the zone of potential agreement, or the ZOPA, right? So between the point I walk away, if I'm negotiating with you, the point you walk away, that's that zone. That's the realm of the possible. But that doesn't tell us where we'll end up within there, right? Like that depends on a whole host of other factors. But you can see, even going in and thinking about those basics of BATNA, reservation price, ZOPA, my understanding is only going to be provisional. How could I possibly know everything going into the negotiation? Now I want to prep it, right? So I want to have some priors. But those priors are things that I either want to confirm or disconfirm in conversation with you before an offer ever gets put on the table. Yeah. Like I want to understand things from your perspective to help to better know what you know. You're not going to reveal, yep, I'll go all the way here and here's my walkway. I'm never going to know that. But at least I want to be closer to. I want to figure out maybe what the limit is, what your actual alternatives are without asking you, hey, what are your alternatives? Because that's going to put you on the defensive and make you invent things. So it's about prepping yourself, thinking through the other side, and using that as the starting point for the conversation.
And the interesting part is, this is not that this is not a complex thing. I don't think this takes a lot of time. It just it's a posted conversation with yourself.
It's totally right. That's totally right. Yep.
And because I actually believe that for a lot of entrepreneurs who feel like every conversation is in the gray, you know, and you know, for several of the CEOs I mentor too, like it's the lack of clarity of is what causes the stress. And so if you just say, hey, listen, you're stressed out about this because you have no idea how to even go into this discussion because you have no idea where this is going to go. So let's prep a little bit. And they don't know what to prep. And I think you kind of giving them what the points are for prep, at least allows you to say, my first few questions are going to illuminate whether these points are even true.
Right. And that's right. Because without that systematic prep, you know, sometimes you can do well in a negotiation, sometimes you can do poorly in a negotiation. And your only explanation then becomes, without doing the prep, is just like, well, I was tough. I wasn't tough. And right, the really superficial explanations instead of, oh, I didn't have sufficient alternatives. Oh, I didn't think through what their alternatives are, right? Like you don't have a framework for even understanding it. And you're right, it's not ultra complicated, but it's just about having the discipline around it to do that kind of pre-work, to do that prep, to be able to go in there and be consistently confident, right? To overcome some of those kind of mental models we said people have about negotiation, and to be able to, you know, advocate for something clear, but also have the confidence to know that I can update my understanding and I'm not going to get rolled because I have my alternatives, I have my walk away, I know kind of what the range is, and you have a lot more confidence in the negotiation. So the one other thing that I think is in parallel to this, so BATNA, reservation price, the ZOPA, that's all important to understand. But I think for yourself, and again for the other party, what you also want to start thinking through is, why might they care about that? Why might be there, you know, what's the underlying interest? Because a reservation price, a walkaway point, is a position. So at this point, I will walk away. But underneath every position we have are some interests, you know, why we do what we do, what we're really trying to accomplish. You know, I care about more money because it gives me more status. And it's really the status thing I'm caring about. So if you could give me status without giving me more money, I'm happy, right?
Like a title in a job or something like that. Yeah.
You got it. That's right. That's right. And I might be readily able to give you more status, but I might struggle to find more money, right? Like, so it's something that's of high value to you, low cost to me. And so by sometimes getting underneath to the why, it opens up more possibilities for more creative resolutions for things that might seem like, you know, a pure kind of zero-sum game. And, you know, or as we talk about it, as a distributive negotiation where it's just a pure win-lose.
Yeah. The one thing that I learned, which I'd love for folks to kind of take in when they're listening, is while this was helpful in the initial negotiation, I figured out something interesting, Tim, was I couldn't ask for help unless I did the prep.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be like, okay, I'm going to go negotiate the sale of this business. Here's left-hand side of, you know, very simple. Left-hand side of the sheet of paper is my position. Right-hand side is theirs. I'm just writing some thoughts, right? I would walk away at this price. I think that they would not do the deal at this price because they can't get some debt financing. Here are the reasons why. Now I can actually go to a mentor and say, or a coach or a business partner and be like, hey, am I thinking about this right? Because if I didn't have that artifact, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
they have no way to think with me.
You got it.
And I realized for me that I almost, the pre-work was not for me walking into the appointment and confident. The pre-work was I couldn't get any help.
Yep.
and that's forced me to do more pre-work, which is like I actually, and so now if I came to you and I said, hey, Tim, I want to run this by you, you're like, Sharran, you're all over the place. But if I said, hey, Tim, I've done some work, let me walk you through my thinking. Here's a document. Yep. And now you're like, oh, I see the holes right away. I can give you some better guidance around this.
Right. So, these two things or whatever. Yeah.
And so the question for you is, I think a lot more people are ready, willing, and able to kind of serve as either a situational mentor, if you will, or a general mentor, because they're like, all right, Sharran's not coming to me with like unfiltered bogus thinking most of the time. And I think that's helped a lot of help gather more mentors around me. And have you seen that, or have you seen something like that? Like when someone walks up to you, how would you coach someone on doing something like that?
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest thing when doing outreach to people who you might want help from or want mentorship from. I mean, I think the thing that paralyzes people from doing something that's actually helpful, and I've certainly experienced this on my own when people are asking me about research topics, hey, I really like this paper, what do you think about blah, 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 is they don't know how to be helpful. Right. And if you're thinking it hasn't been done and you don't have the draft, because what you're describing again is thinking in drafts, right? Like you have to have a draft to go to somebody with. Otherwise, how do they help? Right? Like how do they access it? Right? Like what's their way in? How do they even know if they can be helpful? Because I think oftentimes people want to, especially if it's focused and especially if it's an area where they feel like they can be helpful. But when it's more amorphous and open-ended, I think people on the receiving end of the request start to feel like this is going to be a lot of time and I don't know what to do. Right. So it starts to trigger for me, oh boy, I'm already stressed out enough because of all the other things I have to do. And this person's just going to add to it because they don't know what they're doing. And I don't even know, even if I meet with them for an hour or 2 hours or whatever, am I even going to be able to provide any help? And then I'll just leave feeling like I wasted my time and I wasted their time. And I'll feel bad about myself because I don't know how to help them. Yeah. Right. So where you have things that are more focused and you can bring somebody in a way through an email, whatever, however you reach out to them. Hey, I'm thinking about this and I could use help on this aspect of it. Can I run it by you, kind of my strategy? And I think, I know you're really good at thinking about contingent contracts or something like that, because that might be a way, because we were talking about like a constraint of financing or something like that. How might we be able to work around that? How might we be able to structure something different? I know you think about that really well. Can you help me? Yeah. Then it gives people a way in. So I see that in my field when people are asking about research or advice with programs or things like that. It's about, reaching out in a way, hey, I really like this paper. Here's this aspect that I like. Are you thinking about doing any more about this? Here's what I was thinking. You go in with kind of a focused ask where it's clear you've done your homework on that person and you're articulating how they can be helpful. And it's not an overly sweeping demand.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of tactical stuff on the negotiations. Sure. So a lot of people ask me, it's the, who comes to the table first? Like, is there any research or thought process around, take a situation of buying a business, buying a house, whatever, like is the first offer, who comes up first? And I know you've talked about the anchoring thought process around it. Is there any research around that first offer? Who comes up first? Is it you get the gift of going second? What are your thoughts around who goes first?
So I do believe the research on anchoring is pretty compelling, right? Like, so that initial information, people are influenced by it and people tend to adjust insufficiently afterwards, right? Like it shifts their perception. So when we talk about that zone of potential agreement by the reservation prices of both sides, that first offer can change your perception of that whole thing. And if they give a crazy, if you're the seller and somebody gives you a real lowball offer, you might think, oh, well, they really can't pay any more than that, right? Like, and it shifts your thinking. So I think in terms of the more qualitative aspect of what signal are you sending by reaching out or things like that, I think the biggest problem with that is how it affects our own thinking. I'm in a position of vulnerability, right, by reaching out first. So I don't want to do that. So as long as you're not wrapped up in your own thoughts about, oh, I came to them or they came to me, now I can roll them, like that's the wrong question, right? The right question is, okay, what do I need to get out of such a negotiation? Why do I need this? And what do I think, what's going to make it a workable deal for them? And let's try to get to that destination, because it's really about a joint problem solving activity and less about what's the signal that's sent. And I think sometimes when people worry about the signal that's sent by, do I approach first or whatever, if it's something you want to do, initiate it, right? Like if they can't give you a workable deal, you're going to walk away. That's why all that prep matters.
Right. I remember my partner saying this to me once. He goes, we have no idea what offer we're going to get for the business. And he goes, let's not allow, he's like, Sharran, what if you got something under this number? And you know what I said to him? I was like, I'd be freaking mad. And he's like, good, I'm glad we got that reaction out right now. And there's a good chance that that's going to happen. So when you get something like that, here's what we do.
Yep.
And I was like, what do you mean? I'm like, here's what we do. We have a playbook for when you know you're going to get mad, you say, this is the email we're going to write. Heck, Sharran, write it right now.
Yes.
And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, I really appreciate this offer. These are the 3 things we want to talk about. And I'm like, no. And he goes, you will say you are going to be driving somewhere. You're going to get this in your email. You're going to read this on your phone. You're going to get mad and you're going to reply with something totally stupid. Let's not do that. And that was super interesting for me to say, oh, wow, he took this emotional reaction and he framed it in the conversation, which was really great. I would have never thought to do that. We were just mad. And so even in I love real estate. It's so funny, Tim, I've gone to this. I found that there are like 3 examples that you can always use that people seem to connect with. There's always hey, buy or sell a house. People connect with that.
Yep.
And there is, which is really controversial, this dating example. Like people totally connect with, okay, you can't say something stupid to him or her.
Yep.
And the third is like 6-pack abs example. Like it's amazing. Like everybody wants 6-pack abs, right?
Yes.
So the if you tell somebody, hey, it's going to take you 14 years to get 6-pack abs, like you're not selling any product.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So you got to be a little bit more compelling when you come to that.
Yes.
And so my question on the anchoring stuff for you is there a way to say, if they come up with this, do we respond this way? Do you suggest a little game theory around it, or how do you think through that?
Yeah, so I think, I'll give you 2 answers to that. So one, I just want to hit on that really insightful point you just made about that emotional transformation. And, I'm going to be mad, right? Because one thing we know in a negotiation context, they're emotionally salient and activating kind of context, right? Like, because they feel like they're identity threatening in some kind of ways. I'm a good negotiator or a bad negotiator and all these kind of things. So people derive a lot from these types of conversations. So going in, we know we're already in a spot where we can be activated by small things, right? And when you put big money stakes, I mean, there are fMRI studies that show that, your brain's going haywire, right? When that's happening, right? Like things are really activated and it's easy to get triggered by specific things. And what we know when people get triggered in that kind of way, any kind of creative resolution to a negotiation goes completely out the window, right? Because you start to interpret things in a way, oh, this person's being adversarial, they're attacking me. And it's not because they're just trying to get a better deal, it's because they're a bad person. And that shuts down communication and closes it off, and then you escalate. Right, like so that kind of dynamic unfolds really quickly as a result. So with anchoring can generate the same kind of thing. So if somebody just throws out a wild anchor in a negotiation, it can make you mad because it's like, are they insulting me? What are they doing? How dare they, right? So I think the strategy that is most robust, I mean, you can certainly do things like threaten to walk away or, how dare you, but I think the more constructive thing is to say, hold on, let's take a step back. And let's think about why that offer is even in the universe of the possible for you. Because let me tell you about what I need to get out of this deal. And you keep it at the level of the kind of the abstraction. What are my interests? What do I care about? What's important to me? What do I need to achieve in order to make this workable for me? And then let's talk about that with you. Because sometimes it means there hasn't been enough groundwork. You may have done the prep on your own or with your team in advance, but then when you come to the negotiation and somebody throws out a wild offer that's activating in some kind of way, maybe it's a time to step back and reset the negotiation in terms of process. So how are we going to work together and how do we get underneath what's really motivating that offer? And sometimes they might just have been testing you or bluffing or trying to see if they could just roll you, right? And by forcing it back on, well, why? We can talk about numbers, but I want to understand where that comes from because it's very different from my understanding. So let's get on the same page in terms of understanding. Then we can start working toward a deal, right? So that's one way to blow it up without having to do like you would do if you're buying a car, right? Like you just like, I'm out of here. How dare you? And then they're like, well, wait, come back. It's the end of the month. We really need to close, right?
So what you're saying is, hey, if you get something out of left field, ask them to say, hey, well, can you explain? I didn't understand.
Walk me through how you arrive at them, right? And you can even add in, based on where we need to be and what the way I'm interpreting the market or whatever the kind of macro context of the negotiation is, my understanding is very different. So help me understand from your perspective.
Yeah.
And that takes the temperature down in the room, right? Because it's like, I'm trying to understand your perspective. I want to make sure I hear you. And then as they're laying it out, you can do a lot of kind of mirroring kind of conversation. So let me just make sure that I'm following. So from your perspective, you think this, blah, blah, blah. You know, and then when people feel like they're being heard in that kind of way, they start to open up. So it's the opposite of that emotional transformation. I'm mad, so I'm going to take them down because they're an evil person ruining my experience of negotiation, right? Like instead, it starts to be like, oh, we're collaborating here. We're trying to solve a complex problem together. Right. And we both, our interests need to get met. Otherwise the deal doesn't get done.
I think that even the language patterns around, so help me understand this, yep. And then they work through that. And then you're like, okay, so just so I understand, yep. From your perspective, blah, blah, blah. Yep. So now, one, you soften up to help me understand. And two, now it's like they feel heard. So at least you come to some understanding to get to the next kind of point in the discussion, right?
Exactly. And by saying from your perspective, you're making sure you got it in their words and you're not putting an aspersion, right? Like from your perspective, you're an idiot, you know, right? or from my perspective, you're an idiot, right? You know, but instead I'm trying to, you know, appreciatively hear your words, but then it also opens up for, well, from my perspective, right? Like you can get back, right? And then we could say, okay, there seems to be some difference. What underlies that difference?
Right.
You know, the different perceptions about the future and how that's going to unfold, what the upside is or what the downside risk is. And then you're in a more nuanced conversation where you can get things done.
Yeah. Mechanically speaking, do you have any guidance around, especially with the with executive MBA students that you teach, who are like, you know, leaders of organizations who are mm-hmm. dealing in the gray often.
Mm-hmm.
What is your suggestion around just negotiating conversations maybe regarding when there's money, especially when there's money involved? Have you seen is it more beneficial to do it live? Is it more beneficial to do it over email? Do you have benefits on one over the other? Is it live and then reconfirming over email? What have you found mechanically that has been?
It's a great question. And that's something too, where I suspect we'll start to get some interesting research over the coming years about how that's maybe evolving, given that we're all operating in a very different way right now. But typically the risk of the email negotiation, right? We said these are emotionally fraught to begin with. They're complicated. We just talked about needing to think in drafts. Well, if you're, you know, sending out draft one as the negotiation email, probably not going to end well, right? Like, because all those nuances of tone and the subtlety, and there's not ways to soften as readily. Like we were just saying about how you would do that verbally to get to someplace that more nuanced and sophisticated. So I strongly encourage people to do a more, as Dick Daft, who was a faculty member at Vanderbilt, talked about rich media. So media richness means you get more cues, there's more nuance. So when you do full video, that's better than just email. And when you do face-to-face, you get even more, right? Like, so there are all these kind of things about, you want to be able to, and you can do things synchronously, and that all just makes it easier to come to a shared understanding. I think emails are hard for shared understandings, especially about complex issues, no matter how skilled a writer you are, because it just loses some things, and you could catch people reading it at the wrong moment because you don't know when they're going to access it, right? They might access it just after they've had an argument with a spouse, right? Like, and they're going to, no matter what you said and how carefully you did, they're asking for more, right? Even if you had all kinds of great reasons. So I think that in person, I strongly encourage that if that's a possibility. And if that's not, do something like Zoom or video. And if that's not even possible, even phone is better because it's real time and there's chance to adjust, right? And to learn and to engage in a more fuller conversation, because in order to engage in a negotiation conversation via email, you have to have all the information you need. Like and to be pretty certain about it. And it's just hard to do. And I realize for efficiency, sometimes people have to do it. And that's where the work that you were describing earlier about thinking in drafts and getting feedback from your people and making sure not just the substance is right, but also the tone and what it conveys. Is it kind? Is all those kind of things matter?
So I think the lesson I pulled out from that was, if you can do the synchronous conversation where you're actually talking live in some way,
Yep.
and there is, hopefully we get to some agreements of sort, and then we use email or some form of written word to memorialize.
Yes, absolutely. Right. That kind of lays out the, right, because I mean, and this varies culture to culture too. So like some cultures don't like to, you know, we made an agreement, we clearly are committed to it, right? But I think in the US specifically, you know, it's helpful to have that kind of institutionalizing, formalizing, agreeing to how we're going to carry this out.
Right.
And right, like that's something that needs to be in writing in some kind of way, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. You know, because sometimes we can agree to it in principle, and we might have very different understandings of the principle, right? Yeah. And then the implementation falls apart.
So what's some language pattern guidance around, say you and I have been talking about a deal, and it looks like we have agreed on some kind of next steps and terms. Mm-hmm. And let's say, Tim, you were going to take the ball and say, okay, well, I'm going to quote memorialize this in some way. Yeah. And then we'll flip it to council or whatever. Mm-hmm. What is some language patterns around saying, hey, we've done this hard work of coming to this agreement.
Right.
How do we say, all right, Sharran, now I'm gonna let me recap to see if what would be that?
Absolutely, but it's exactly that, right? Like let me just make sure we're in agreement on these points. So let's kind of walk through what we've detailed in this conversation, right? Like what step one? Okay, we're doing X, we're doing Y, we're doing Z over this time period. Does that reflect your understanding of what we've agreed to, the conversation we've just had? And what am I missing, right? Like, so keeping it open-ended with, you know, what am I missing? Is there anything that we didn't, that's not in the proposal, or it's worded in a way that's you're not comfortable with? Let's just make sure we've got the understanding before we turn it over to kind of, you know, formalizing it in contractual language. Are we in agreement about how this is playing out here? Because we've done so much hard, right? Because we've done all this hard work together, and we both think we've got a deal that works for us.
Right.
Let's just make sure we have the same understanding, you know, before we do the detail work, right?
So mechanically, you know, people will be like, well, that's interesting that Sharran and Tim are talking about this, but in real world, it doesn't work that way. Or, well, let's bring it to life for a second. Let's say you and I are talking about something, Tim, and there's 5 points just that we're working towards, and say we agree on 3 out of the 5. Mm-hmm. This conversation, mm-hmm. how would you kind of take the win on the 3 mm-hmm. and set up the conversation for the next 2? How would you kind of frame that?
Mm-hmm. Right, that it's something we need to revisit. Right. You know, so you're saying, okay, we've got some really good, well, so the hard thing, one of the challenges about separating out the issues too, is sometimes, you know, where we're able to get our best deals on really complex things is when we bundle them all together, right? You know, because then we can see how they might combine in unique ways. And sometimes segmenting out, if we leave the 2 hard ones for the end, it might change our understanding of the 3 other ones, and it might cause us to reopen those. So that's one of the risks with that. But I think if we got to a point where we're, you know, 60% of the way there, but we know we need more to get to the end, I think what I would spend the end of that conversation doing, well, it seems like we're moving in the right direction, right? Like we're making some progress together. We have some, you know, at least agreement in principle. I think we both understand, you know, where we need to go, but maybe in the interim for these last couple of issues that are still outstanding, let's spend some time right now thinking about how we would even go about reaching a resolution, you know, like, so turn it into a process question about how do we get somewhere on those last 2, okay? You know, rather than saying, you know, let's each come up with an idea for the last 2, like, what's the process for even getting to something that's going to be workable for the last 2? You know, what do we think we did well here that was able to resolve these others? How do we know that we've got the rest of it, or we're ready to talk again? What do we need to figure out? What are the missing elements? Is it some data? Is it a perspective of somebody who's outside this transaction? You know, what is it?
Yeah, that's really cool, because now you're saying, hey, I've got some out of the 3, we move in the right direction. because I think even just clarity on language patterns helps a lot of people, right? Just
Oh, it totally does. I mean, right, because you need to break it down to that, because like you said at the outset when we were talking about BATNA and reservation price and ZOPA, like that's, pretty high level, right? Like you need to get into how do you say it? And when things, especially when things get heated in a negotiation, how do you keep focused on the things you care about? Yeah, so the language patterns, I'm 100% on board. That's really important.
I'll give you give you and everyone else two very interesting things that happened that one that completely blew a deal apart from a language pattern perspective, and one that my partner softened, even though it happened. So we were very close to a deal, and the buyer of this business had a not so savvy advisor on their side. And we had agreed on all terms, and literally we were waiting on the final email. And Tim, I will never forget these words. He writes, this email goes, Peter and Sharran, we have decided, this is the first line. We have decided to arbitrarily reduce the purchase price by blank. And like, how do you say something like that? Like literally my partner, Peter, was like, he called me, he goes, they could have said it so many different ways. And it was not even a significant amount. It was less than 1% of the deal. So it didn't even matter. But leading with the, we have decided to arbitrarily reduce the purchase. And he goes, this alone, I am done in principle, right? And so blew the deal up. That deal was done after that email.
Right.
And my partner called, like we did a principal to principal call and said, hey, you either remove the advisor or this deal's done. Like that got done.
Right. Did they not know what the word arbitrarily means? That was my question. Right?
Because from a language perspective, I think it's super important to realize that a deal like that is supercharged, right? So absolutely. I will never forget that line. And the second, I know this is a PG kind of show, but like this was a 6 a.m. phone call, 9 a.m. East Coast time, 6 a.m. Pacific time. Yep. And their counsel called our counsel a petulant a-hole.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was like, I don't even know what the word petulant means. Like I'm literally like dictionary.com. I'm like, what is this word? And I'm like, don't be a petulant a-hole. And I'm like, what, how like this is.
I like that a-hole wasn't sufficient. You had to add that modification to it, right? You're especially petulant.
I didn't. So it's clearly not a GMAT word, so, which I didn't memorize. But there's the big learning in all of this, just from a language pattern perspective, is one, converting the wins or banking the wins and saying, hey, now it's a process. Let me go do some analysis on this and get some data. Let me talk to Vogus on this and get this. I'll come back to it with these three things, and maybe this will give us better information for our next conversation.
You got it. That's it. That's it. Right. Right. Because those things, both those circumstances you described with the language pattern was escalation, right? That it didn't need to be said that way, but it did. There was some logic to it, presumably. Well, although with arbitrarily, not clear. But the other one, you see, it was somebody just getting really mad, right, and just kind of lashing out, right, trying to be extra flowery with how they did it.
We could, I could jam way more tactical questions on you on this one, but more importantly, now, if folks want to find out more about either on T-Love or on where do people go to get more of Tim Vogus?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, just as Tim Vogus. I'm on Twitter at capital OWEN, number 4, capital AIDAN, at Owen for Aiden. So Aiden is my oldest child, 18 years old son. And there's a longer story around that, but that's why that moniker. But that's where you can find me on Twitter. So I post a lot of links to research and other kinds of interesting things on Twitter, also with some hip hop opinions on there periodically. And LinkedIn, I do some of the same too, and we'll post talks I give and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a big part of my adult career, and me being who I am is owed to you. So can't thank you enough for being a super cool friend and mentor to me, and for being on today, man. I really appreciate it.
thank you for always making me better and making every institution you're a part of realize its potential and its mission better, because that's what you do and that's what you've always done. And that's why you are the overwhelming success you are, and why people want you as a mentor, a coach, and a person who gives them great insights.